Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and for those joining us online, welcome. My name is Jihad Abu Salim, and I'm honored to be with you here tonight. I serve as the Executive Director of the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. The Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development, as many of you know, is more than just an institution. We are an organization of service, a platform of understanding, and a vehicle for change. As an independent nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C., our primary mission is twofold: to foster a deep awareness about Palestine and the Palestinian experience, both in the United States and beyond, and also strive to ameliorate the lives of Palestinians, whether they are in Palestine or in the diaspora. Our endeavors span a wide spectrum, from humanitarian relief, community development support to educational programs, policy analysis, and an unwavering commitment to promoting Palestinian culture through art, literature, and music and film. This month in particular holds a plethora of enriching events here at the Jerusalem Fund. On October 7th, we will gather in remembrance of the incredible Dr. Halim Barakat, who was a member of the Palestine Center Committee in collaboration with the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And as we mark 2 decades since the passing of the Palestinian scholar and activist Edward Said, I invite you to join us on October 17th for the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. We will be privileged to host Professor Wadi' Edward Said, who is Edward Said's son, and he will shed light on the enduring legacy of his father, Edward Said's passion for justice, his influence on generations of scholars, and his relentless advocacy for the Palestinian cause, as well as for other marginalized groups within the United States and beyond. And on October 19th, we're excited to host another book talk. I think also the book is published by Interlink Publishing, the same publisher who published tonight's book, featuring Reverend Donald Wagner, his book Glory to God in the Lowest: Journeys to an Unholy Land, talking about his experience as an evangelical reverend who moved from supporting Zionism to advocating for Palestinian rights. And tonight, we are here to discuss a particularly timely work, The Wall Between: What Palestinians and Jews Don't Want to Know About Each Other. This book delves deep into the walls, both physical and metaphorical, that persist between Jewish and Palestinian communities in the diaspora. The authors, who I will introduce shortly, confront the pivotal meta-narratives that define the way Palestinian and Jewish communities in the diaspora approach each other and reflect about their traumas, identities, and examine the barriers that have long dominated the discourse between the two communities. And they urge us towards a justice-centered approach, advocating for understanding, mutual respect, and reconciliation. And I am personally excited to hear more from our authors. A few housekeeping rules before we start. We will first hear from our authors, and then we will open we'll open it for questions and answers. For those of you who are tuning online via Facebook and YouTube, feel free to leave your questions in the comment sections, and we will make sure to convey them to our speakers here. So allow me to introduce our authors. Jeffrey J. Wilkinson is an American Jew who lives in Canada. He holds a doctorate in education from the University of Toronto and works actively in the Jewish community and beyond on issues relating to trauma and the Israel-Palestine struggle. Jeff's partnership with Raja, born out of deep listening and learning together, has become central to his work. Welcome, Jeff. And then we also were honored to have Raja G. Khouri, who's the CEO of Khouri Conversations, a human rights and inclusion consultant, the founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, board member at Project Rosanna in Canada, and a former 10-year commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He is Canada Committee member of Human Rights Watch and co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. So without further ado, Raja and Jeffrey, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jihad, and everyone for this warm welcome. It's been a long journey, not in traffic specifically, but that I've traveled to get to the point that I'm at today. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about my personal story and how I ended up partnering, with Jeff on this project. Back in 2006, I was on a committee put together by the province of Ontario to make recommendations on how to better counter hate and how to better help victims of hate. And as you would expect on a committee like that, there were people from all communities, and including a couple of members from the Jewish community. And as it happened, one was sitting on my left and the other one sitting on my right. And our work there was about human rights, about preventing hate against everyone and anyone, right? And I had always been, an advocate for Palestinian rights, and that continues until today. It's just the path that I've taken, the road, the means have sort of developed, over time. So, sitting between these two Jewish colleagues, of course, we started talking, we started debating issues and having some private conversations. And, and it turned out to me, by the end of the year of the mandate of that committee, I realized that we have a lot in common when it comes to respecting human rights for everyone, countering hate. And of course, when we had some of these private conversations, we would get into the issue of, Israel, Palestine. And even there, I found some common ground. And I thought, wait a minute, obviously there are things here I did not know. What more can I find out if I got to know these people more and we had these kinds of conversations more regularly? And that started this, 16-year journey of dialogue. Dialogue sometimes has a bad reputation because you dialogue and then nothing happens, right? Particularly for Palestinians who engage with Jewish colleagues in dialogue, they reach a point where there is a barrier for both. And for Palestinians, that barrier is you have to recognize the Nakba and address it and do something about it, or we can't move forward. And to Jews, it is, no, we have to have Israel. We have to protect Israel as a Jewish majority state. And that's a red line. And that's, that impasse normally ends with the dialogue falling apart and the groups kind of going each in their own direction. So, but in my case, we continued, at least with some of the members of the dialogue group. Some people over time gave up, got busy with other things, but it continued with some members. And the learning went on for 16 years. Now, we have to recognize that you don't learn from people who agree with you, right? You dialogue with people where there's disagreement that you want to try and understand, right? So, what I ended up learning in that process over years and years and years is that with certain Zionists, there is enough common ground for us to be able to work together. And I say some because right-wing Zionists are beyond reach as far as I'm concerned. Now, Palestinians make often, I'm going too long, am I?
You got a lot to say, right?
All right. I'll tell you one thing that to demonstrate the learning. Zionism. The first time I hear from anyone that Zionism is a movement towards Jewish self-determination was when I started talking to Jews. So I learned that from that. Zionism for me was a dirty word. you want to insult someone, you call him a Zionist, and among Palestinians, Arabs, and in general. But so that was an eye opener. Oh, for you, it's that. For me, it's something else, clearly. And they learned from me that for us, Zionism means that everything that Zionism gave to Jews, it took away from us. It took away from Palestinians, right? So this is an example of the kind of learning that happens when you actually, talk to each other. And, of course, even after 16 years with progressive Zionists, there are points of disagreement, but I think there are a lot more points of agreement between us and them than between them and the right-wing Zionists. And that's become very clear recently in Israel and how these two parts of society are clashing so so strongly over what kind of Israel they want to have. So and then this gentleman, he will tell you how we met and how we came to work together.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here. This is, really neat to be in DC and have these conversations over the last 3 nights. The core thing for me, I guess I want to share is that the Jews that, I know and that Raja talked with, had certain barriers of what they could really learn and grow from. And I would say primarily this is from trauma. So just so happens tonight that in the second row is a friend of mine from childhood that I've not seen since I was probably 14 in Binghamton, New York, where we grew up.
So
And
about a couple of years ago?
A couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So he knew me as Jeff Wilkinson, the Christian guy, because my Jewish mother, Holocaust surviving mother, converted to Christianity when I was little. Now, the reason this is really important for this conversation is I wasn't exposed to Jewish trauma as a kid. I didn't know anti-Semitism. I knew I was Jewish, but barely. I didn't begin to really practice Judaism until my mid-30s. I was very exposed to it because my uncle and his 4 children remained Jewish always. So I always had some experience of the holidays and some experience of what it meant to be Jewish. But I really grew up in a very devout Christian space. I think I never really got it. I acted like I got it, but I never really got it. But it was an important part of my formative years. But I didn't have the same exposure to Jewish trauma that most of the colleagues that Raja worked with did. In a large part, I think that's why we ended up here together, because it was much easier for me to hear the Palestinian story without being affected as a Jew. It's a whole bunch of things I could share. I'll tell you one brief story about me and how we got here. So I spent my core being is as a musician and music teacher. That's what I spent my life doing. And somewhere along the road, I got into human rights work. I got really interested in why some people, have freedom and do well in school and some people don't. And I really wanted to know about that. And, that actually led me to be an equity officer for a large school board outside of Toronto. And, I did a lot of personal journey on this thing we call privilege. Me as a man, living in a white body, I'm identifying as heterosexual, all these privileges I really got deeply into and tried to unpack and understand. But I actually had a privilege that I didn't know I had. And that was that I got to talk about my Judaism, and my family's experience in the Holocaust. And nobody ever asked me if I was doing that, to be able to promote something about me. It was just taken for granted. So I ended up in my first day in a doctoral class, small little class, and the professor says, we're going on a field trip. Well, what? 2 blocks from the university, we end up at an anti-Israeli apartheid rally. I'm standing next to the only other Jew in the class, and he's more visible than me. He's got kippah, he's got talsim coming out of his shirt. And I'm there going, oh yeah, I'm protecting yet another group of rights. This is awesome. And all of a sudden the eyes turned at us. They didn't see us as advocates. They saw us as oppressors. And I got really upset about this. I went back to class and I talked about, they seem so angry. And 3 or 4 of my small group of classmates were either Palestinian or very active in Palestinian rights. And were basically looking at me very strangely. What do you have to be angry about? And this led me to my journey of questioning why I had certain I had certain place because my parents and my grandparents had experienced the Holocaust and lived as Jews. And I never thought about it. I never thought about it. And I realized that I knew almost nothing about the Palestinian story. So I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on Israel-Palestine, and I interviewed Jews and Palestinians, this being one of my Palestinian victims that I got to talk to. And from that, and mainly was in the area of social psychology and trauma and memory. And I got really, really curious about how our memories keep us apart. And I wanted to understand better. And that's really what led us to the last really 4.5 years of sitting across the table, usually with hummus and labneh, talking about our stories and listening, deep challenge and listening about, each of us. And so that led us to this. Maybe I'll just introduce the book quickly, and then the first part of the first part, and then you can carry on.
You forgot
Did I forget something?
to tell them that you ate mluchia as well in my plate.
Yes, I did. I've eaten a lot of amazing things. Lucky me. He's an excellent Palestinian Lebanese chef. So our journey here was about understanding how this barrier became between our groups and walking this very delicate fine line, because both of us are very strong advocates for Palestinian rights. I am a Jew, but I'm not a Zionist. I have come to a place where I cannot support Zionism as a project. And I need to, where I cannot support Zionism as a project, I appreciate deeply why most of my tribe does. I value it really immensely. I was also exposed very much as a kid and a young adult to evangelical Christian Zionism. And I also understood deeply why that was important. But the line for me is really a fairly simple one. My freedom came at his expense. That doesn't work for me. So we really tried to walk this line of being very clear about Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice, and also saying to Jews and Palestinians that we need to value the trauma of the other, that we need to learn and discover the humanity in the other that has really been stripped here in the West because of dearth of real discourse between Jews and Palestinians. So the metaphor of the wall is taken in 4 parts in our book. The first part is how we come to know, so how we shape the wall, which is a straightforward learner's guide 101 to how trauma, identity, and victimhood trap us in our silos.
Yeah, I mean, the book is about narratives, how they get formed, and then how they become solidified, how they become manipulated, how they become used and weaponized for, for certain agendas. So, as Jeff said, we start with, how the wall is built, what shapes these narratives. And of course, by large part, it's issues of trauma, identity, and victim, and so on. And then we look at, okay, so this is what shapes these 2 narratives, and what form do they take when you look at some of the key issues of conflict between the 2 communities. Remember, we're talking about people here in North America, about the diaspora, not over there. Over there, it's a different story. And some of the main issues of conflicts are anti-Semitism, Zionism and the Nakba, and then we've got Palestinian resistance. So these are what we call the bricks in the wall. This is where the narratives clash completely, and and where that wall becomes really solid. And then after that, the wall gets hardened. How does it get hardened? By weaponizing the narrative. So we've got groups, advocacy groups, lobby groups, political action groups, whose sole job is to keep us in our places, keep us loyal to the tribe, sticking to the party line, not veering away from it, so that they can maintain their agenda and there is a backing and a constituency, for their agenda. So they take that trauma that we already have, put their thumbs on it, rub the wound, to keep it there, keep it hurting, so that we are putty in their hands. We are, they can guide us to where they want to take us.
You do part three. Oh, you've done part three.
I've done part
So,
You weren't listening, were you?
I was intently, my friend. So the three parts that we've talked about, or the 2 and 3, are really, they're tough reading. I mean, they're tough slugging. The fourth part is the hope part. Is how do we deconstruct this weaponization? How do we listen? How do we learn, to build understanding and build allyship? We aren't focused particularly on peace, but we are focused on reconciliation and justice. And we are focused on how to build alliances where that trauma gets set, a little bit aside. We'll talk probably more about it later. We have this wonderful thing in the back of our grade, which social science is called the hippocampus and the little tiny peanut called the amygdala. This runs our responses. Our work is to engage people in the prefrontal cortex that actually has a logic ability to say that because I feel this doesn't make it so. And because I'm threatened by the person in front of me doesn't mean I have to be. So part 4 really deals with how we undo the harm and begin a new path forward towards what we call values forward thinking. So we're going to start by reading 3 little excerpts from the middle chapters on anti-Semitism, Zionism, the Nakba, and Palestinian resistance.
Right. So yeah, so in the last part of the book, we give the reader a choice. You can continue to be driven by your trauma and manipulated by propaganda, or you can choose to look for justice, what we proclaim here in the West to be our core values of justice, human rights, freedom, equality, and so on. And that's that's sort of the light at the end of the tunnel that we show the reader after an extensive review of what the issues are, how they're seen, and why. Okay. So in the chapter on anti-Semitism, we're going to read you 2 short pieces that show how the narratives are so different from each other.
Yes, and just as a sort of thing we say it, at the beginning of the book, is these are the pluralist of opinion. This isn't every Jew and every Palestinian. This is the general mainstream way of thinking. To a Jew, anti-Semitism is a past trauma, a present trauma, and an almost guaranteed future trauma. Anti-Semitism is a thread that runs through the tapestry of Jewish life. It's ever-present, foreboding, and certain. It weaves its way, often surreptitiously and silently, through even the happiest of times. It is the monster whose haunting presence breathes down one's neck, refusing to allow any Jew to forget its existence.
To a Palestinian, anti-Semitism is a muzzle, a weapon to silence, defend, and deflect from, or otherwise discredit critics of Israel's actions. It's a club to clubber the heads of those taking a stand for Palestine, and the shackle that ties down the hands of solidarity. It is the boot that presses down one's neck, choking speech, silencing thought, removing voice, and eliminating hope. It is an occupation of the narrative.
Which means that anti-Semitism is this powerful force that in effect ends up, oppressing both Jews and Palestinians.
You know, I mean, as a Palestinian, I've always, and when I hear anti-Semitism, I go like this. Why? Because yes, it could be Jew hatred by some, right-wing nationalist, skinhead, whatever it is, and this sadly continues to happen and has been on the rise lately. But it could be a silencing of a Palestinian or a Palestinian supporter who has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews, just defending Palestinian rights. And in some circles, sadly, defending Palestinian rights has become equated with anti-Semitism, or even worse, supporters of terrorism. So this is the weaponization part that we mentioned earlier, right? So we've got these organizations, we call them bad actors, bad with two Ds, because what they're
really bad. That's
yeah, I mean, that makes them ultra bad. So bad that means they blame, attack, demonize, and then dismiss the other side. Blame, attack, demonize, and dismiss. So yeah, you are anti-Semitic. And then all of a sudden you have to defend yourself. To prove you don't want to be called anti-Semitic, you're not anti-Semitic. So, and that's how it works. That's how it works.
Cheat paper.
Okay, sure thing. Yeah.
Okay, so we're now going to read a little excerpt from Zionism and the Nakba, and I just want to check because I don't always know my audience. Is everyone clear what the term Nakba means? I know I'm in that space, but I want to make sure that that everyone that everyone understands that it is the Arab word for catastrophe, and it defines the displacement and ruin of 1948. Not loud enough, of 1948. Thank you for reminding me. You be my check, okay? Thank you. For a Jew, Zionism and historic Jewish suffering are intrinsically linked and go to the heart of the Jewish experience and identity. What the land of historic Palestine is, known biblically as the land of the land of Israel, or Eretz Israel, has cultural, religious, and spiritual meaning for most Jews. Zionism is life to one, yet death, and death to another. To one group, the events of 1948 symbolize redemption and are the answer to thousands of years of dislocation, oppression, and murder. Yet for the other, these same events represent the loss of everything, total dispossession, their greatest personal and existential tragedy.
It is hard to overestimate what the Nakba has meant to Palestinians. It is much more than losing their home, land, and homeland. It was being told that they could never go back. It was living as eternal refugees in countries that did not always accept them and often were hostile towards them. It was a loss of identity as they attempted to assimilate into identities not their own. It was the bitterness of defeat that would be repeated upon them over and over again. It was the loss of livelihood and enduring life in camps and squalor, in poverty and destitute, shamed and looked down upon, and where in instances they would be bombed and massacred. I grew up in Lebanon. I saw this happen in front of me over and over again.
So are we okay? Have we depressed you to the point? Okay.
So we've done, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the Nakba, and the third one is Palestinian resistance. And I have to tell you, until I started talking to Jews, I didn't realize how much it affected them and how it affected them. And to me, resistance is when you're being oppressed, you resist. I mean, I didn't realize how the simple act of resisting the oppression was threatening to Jews here. And we'll read to you a little bit about that.
Jews at the bottom.
Oh, we're switching parts. I'm speaking for Jews now. To Jews, Palestinian resistance means terrorism and destruction of Israel. It means Islamist fanatics willing to blow themselves up to kill Jews and destroy Israel. It means Hamas hurling rockets at Sderot to kill innocent Jews and destroy Israel. It means boycotts that aim to discredit Israel in order to destroy it. It means accusations of apartheid aimed at smearing Israel and then destroy it. It means Islamic countries ganging up to demonize Israel in international forums in order to destroy it.
The UN.
This is trauma speaking, right?
Absolutely. To Palestinians, resistance is a philosophical and existential condition. As long as they resist, their will cannot be broken. As long as they resist, they will continue to exist. As long as they resist, they remain the bane of the Zionist project. They resist by any means, over there in Israel, Palestine, through defiance, martyrdom, jihad. And over here in the North American diaspora, through advocacy, art, film, poetry, music, theater, and of course, boycotts.
Now again, main reason we wrote this book is to share the learning that we gained as we went, through this journey and what we learned, from it. So when I was talking about how Palestinian resistance in the minds of people, here is threatening, it's because of their emotional attachment to Israel, and Israel being the safety net, the preventer of the future Holocaust that will likely happen, because that's the history of Jews, and that's trauma talking. That's trauma speaking. So when Hamas rockets hit Sderot, or southern Israel, people in the Bronx feel it, because it's a threat to what they believe to be their safety net. If Israel had been there in 1945 or 1940 to 45, there would not have been a Holocaust. Israel would have protected the Jews. That's how and please, you're the expert on it. So I just wanted to set the ground for you to explain it better.
Sure. I'm gonna I will, and I also want to leave lots of opportunity, because we've often found in these talks that the questions from the audience lead to the richest of the conversation. So we'll talk a little bit about trauma. It is likely the most misunderstood and often a misdiagnosed condition amongst all of us. It is usually seen, as a horrific event that you might call big T trauma. So something that happened to you without your permission in your childhood, abuse, the loss of a parent, the loss of a spouse, something really powerful. And it is that. Yet it's not only that. It is small, what we usually refer to as small T trauma. It is those everyday events that kind of stop or interrupt our natural flow of how we would have preferred things to go. Trauma is usually seen as a past event, but it is a recurrence of the past in the present. Trauma is about memory. When we all say, I remember when, we think we're recounting a historical event. We're actually recounting the memory of that event, which is fluid and present. It is not past. It is in the moment. And usually when Jews and Palestinians, for example, are talking, they think they're talking about historical fact or past creation. They're actually talking about how it feels to be who they are right now, how it feels not to be heard, how it feels to be misunderstood. And we both, I think fairly say that we're pretty angry about the things that happen over there. But we have decided that for our path, this is the most productive use of our talents to create a different future. It's not everybody's path. We are very glad that some people are out there, do very brave things and protest at the West Bank and protest at the embassies. Very glad. But it isn't our path. We don't believe that outrage solves much. Feels nice for a few minutes, but solutions come from actually deeply listening.
Just one last thought. Palestinians, when Sheikh Jarrah situation happened 2 years ago, to Palestinians, this was the Nakba all over again. It wasn't an isolated event, right? And realistically, I know whenever I encounter a opinion column about Israel, Palestine, or an event that happened, or someone on a panel, or everything that happens in front of me, it starts from the Nakba. And to Jew, it starts from the Holocaust. These are the two meta-narratives for the two communities. And I'm sorry if we took too long, but over to you, sir.
That we largely talk about, and I'll just, kind of piggyback as Jihad sits down. There is an important distinction. The Holocaust is still happening traumatically, but it isn't happening
Physically.
Actually physically. It is absolutely unspeakable. It is still something. I mean, students, for instance, ask me, why did that happen? How could that possibly happen? I don't attempt to answer it because it makes it fathomable, and it's not fathomable. I intend to say that man's cruelty to other mankind, to humankind, has no limits unless we put limits on it. At the same time, for Palestinians, the Nakba is not a past event. It happens every day, and not just in memory. It happens through the occupation. It happens through settlements. And I think that my community has really resisted understanding this. And we hope that we can help them understand it in a non-threatening way.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions for both of you, and then we'll open it for our esteemed guests here in the room. And I would like to start from, this caveat every time, when I say what I'm about to say, I like to say that I'm not a big fan of romanticizing history. But when I think about Palestine around the time the Zionist project started to, become an influential force in the politics and in shaping the political reality on the ground in Palestine, changing the demographic composition of the country. Palestine was coming out of, let's call it a cosmopolitan experience as part of the Ottoman Empire, which was multicultural, multi-religious. And for me, I'm always amazed at how in Palestine, the most important religious / cultural festival, or what we Palestinians call as Mawsim, was called Mawsim al-Nabi Musa, right? The festival of Prophet Moses, where Palestinians would make pilgrimage to a tomb named after Prophet Moses, Muslim and Christian, by the way. And I don't know if Palestinian Jews took part in these festivities. Near Gaza, near the shore, the most important annual festival was called the Valley of Ants, in reference to a verse in the Quran that talks about the passage of Prophet Solomon's armies and an ant that spoke saying, beware soldiers, beware fellow ants. This is Prophet Solomon's army. So these references that subscribe to Palestine's rich, multi-religious, multicultural heritage were there. And again, this isn't to romanticize. And then the Zionist movement came and said, well, there is one narrative that defines this place. And there is and historically, this narrative is a continuation of a history that happened 2000 years ago, stopped happening, and then resumed happening again with the arrival of, with the rise of modern Zionism. The rest is irrelevant. So for Palestinians, when they look at Zionism, they look at a national movement that's rooted in an exclusive narrative about the land. And many Palestinians argue, and as you know, as a Palestinian, I'm biased here, that due to Zionism, we are dealing with this reality today where there is a powerful force that says there is one narrative, there is one culture, there is one language, there is one flag, there is this village's name is so and so. I grew up next to a settlement in a city called Deir al-Balah in the middle of the Gaza Strip, and the settlement that was close to where I lived was called Kfar Darom. And Darom was the ancient Canaanite name for the city where I come from. And but 300 Israeli settlers lived in Kfar Darom versus 60,000 Palestinians in Deir al-Balah. And I do remember that when a settler needed to cross from the settlement into Israel, that the Israeli military would close the main road. So I say all of that, and pardon me for the rambling, but because many Palestinians would argue that this reconciliation cannot happen until we go beyond Zionism. Now, what does this beyond look like in your opinion? And then once you discuss this, I would also like to ask something about the present. Now that I addressed the past, but is there beyond Zionism, and is that something that we can reach one day?
Well, there's a lot
Well,
there,
it's,
isn't there?
yeah, you chose an easy one to start.
Yeah, we start us off. Should I start, and you can, or do you have something right on?
It looks
tip of
like
your
you're
tongue?
ready to go, so
I'm good to wait for you too, my friend.
Well, everything you said is right. I mean, I agree with everything you said. Is Zionism, the way Zionism has manifested itself has certainly been very exclusionary and increasingly so. I mean, it's the early Zionists were, like moderate babies compared to the current day Zionists. So the nationalism, the ethnic nationalism has been increasing, as we have seen, to the point that today we have about fascist and the Israeli government. So yeah, that's been the trajectory. Now, given that our work was mostly about people here, and our understanding of what's been gone through, there is has been a growing evolution among the diaspora Jews of what Zionism is and what it should be. And I point to the journalist intellectual Peter Beinart, who he identified as a progressive Zionist for the longest time, and then his view of Zionism kept changing, and he says it publicly. The way it changed is by talking to Palestinians, which is again what we talk about here. Is we need to talk to each other and understand where things are coming from. And now Peter Beinart, he says, Zionism has done a lot of wrongs to Palestinians, and yes, the idea of keeping Jews safe is important to me as a Jew. It's Peter Beinart speaking, but it should not be at the expense of Palestinians, and it doesn't have to be a Jewish majority state that oppresses, Palestinians. So I take heart in this kind of evolution that's been happening, especially among the younger generations who are removed from the Holocaust, two generations removed from the Holocaust. Also, as well, among the young Palestinians who are generations removed from the Nakba and are accepting that we have to share this land. We have to find a way to share this land. The Jews of Israel today are not going to go back to Germany and Poland and all of that stuff. They're going to stay. And we are staying. The Palestinians, they're not going either. So it becomes a matter, how do we share this land in a way that is equitable and just, for all? And this is, I think, the hope that I cling to personally.
Great.
Did I steal your thunder?
You did great. Didn't not at all. You said you did your thunder, which is perfect. So what I'm going to say is a couple of things that I talk a lot to my community about. To Jews, Zionism, is a spectrum. There are progressive Zionists, there are liberal Zionists, there are cultural Zionists, there are rabid right-wing Zionists. There are all kinds of Zionists. To Palestinians, there's only one kind of Zionists, people who stole their land.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we have to start, because the people that we all work with say constantly, well, we're not like that. Well, that's not how you're perceived. Because as long as you define yourself as a Zionist, you're connecting yourself to the project that took everything from Palestinians. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is there has to be room for journey. So I was talking to a colleague, a professor colleague and friend, and he says to me, he says, Jeff, you cannot separate me, the Jew, and me, the Zionist. They're the same. There is no difference. You're trying to separate them. There's no difference. And I kept going, okay. And he just kept talking. He's so passionate. He just talked for like 20 minutes till I finally, literally over Zoom said, stop. You're not talking anymore. Stop. And he said, okay. He said, you didn't allow me to ask you the key question. What do you mean by Zionism? So when you say Zionism, what people hear is that you must have a Jewish majority state that is an ethnocracy, not a democracy, that has rights for one at the expense of another. Is that what you mean by Zionism? I said, well, not necessarily. Now we have a space to talk. So I never expect Raja or any other Palestinians to say, well, I'm okay talking to Zionists. I'll do whatever I need to do. It's all good. But literally in all of my change advocacy in life, when have I ever changed a mind that agreed with me that was productive? I've said for years, like, why does a teacher in the staff room who identifies as LGBTQ have to sit next to, a person they experience as homophobic, and talk to them? Well, you don't. But please tell me how you're going to change their mind if you don't. How you're going to expose them to a different vision of who you are as a human if you don't talk to them. So I think in essence, our message is that you cannot ask Palestinians, to renovate their view of Zionism. Zionism is a destructive force to a Palestinian, period, end of sentence. What you can ask them to do is, how are you going to change the reality? Are you going to change the reality by being angry and protesting only? Or is part of that change of reality a broader way of approach? So we talk, a lot in our book about things like BDS, the IHRA definition. These are big boundaries for people. So, as BDS supporters, do I, as a Jew, have a stake in saying whether I like BDS or not? No, this is because I'm not the one who's they're protesting my oppression. You can protest your oppression in any non-violent way that you choose to. And some choose a violent way, which I'm not happy about. But at the same time, while I understand why Ukrainians, actively, violently resist their oppression, I also understand why some Palestinians do. It's not that I necessarily like it, but I understand. But our question sometimes is, if you are so rigid, so we have two groups that we relate to in Israel. One's called Combatants for Peace, and the other is the Grieving Parents Circle that work together with Jews and Palestinians to really listen to each other's trauma and make change. BDS has banned these groups. So we do ask people for some sense of stepping back, some sense of, is this a reparative path that you've chosen? You know, is it helpful for students at a university to ban kosher food because they think it comes from Israel and therefore violence BDS? Seriously, is that going to be productive? No, it's not going to be productive. You had a part two, I think.
I have a part two, and then we'll open it for Q&A. Thank you for this. And part two concerns trauma and power. And I'm curious about why you chose the diaspora or the diasporas as the communities that you, I mean, I'm assuming your experiences as people who live in outside of, you know, the boundaries of what I would call historic Palestine, living in Canada or in the US. And as you said in the beginning of your talks, people here feel that they have a lot of stakes in what's going on there. But how do you approach, or before that, when people engage with the different models for exchange between Palestinians and Israelis, that since the beginning of the peace process, there have been a lot of projects to build bridges and create quote-unquote dialogue. And most of the critiques towards these initiatives revolved around the fact that how can you, like you said, how can you have dialogue given the imbalance of power, given the discrepancy in privilege? You know, Palestinians and Israelis could talk, but then the Israeli would go back to the city or the settlement or wherever they live, travel the world, be able, you know, have all sorts of freedoms. Palestinians will go and get stuck on a checkpoint for hours.
This is the problem with dialogue.
This is the problem with
why
dialogue.
we do the way we do it, because this is the ultimate problem, is that without repair, the oppressed side is always going to walk away. So our job is to say, my job, is to say to my community is, if you're talking seriously about being upset at Palestinian injustice, what are you willing to give up for it? What are you willing to lay on the line? You know, are you willing to not have, you know, complete freedom at the wall in Jerusalem? You know, are you willing to create spaces where Palestinians who are forced out could come back? You know, are you willing to take on some risk that this may not work out well? Because ultimately, when you talk about things like a two-state solution, you are saying, I will take no risk. I will talk about some fantasy that we know will never happen because it makes me feel better. So you have to put, real change requires you, you know, to give up something.
You know, even the most well-meaning Zionists, progressive Zionists, cling to the two-state solution because the alternative is scary to them. The alternative to them is a Muslim majority state in which Jews can be oppressed the way Palestinians are being oppressed now. And that's, again, you know, that's trauma speaking. That's thinking that what happened in the past is going to happen in the future, which is what, you know, Jeff was saying about, you know, about trauma. And, you know, one of the surprises that I came across when I started the dialogue process is realizing that Jews do not see themselves as the oppressor. Even Jews here who have these, you know, monster advocacy organizations where, you know, every member of Congress almost out of, you know, except 5 or 6 vote pro-Israel every time. They don't see themselves as oppressors. They still see themselves as victims. Victims of anti-Semitism, the victims of people who want to destroy Israel.
Being a small little democracy in the middle of a
Yeah.
scary
Yeah, I mean,
proud people.
I was flabbergasted. I mean, I started the dialogue process thinking Israel's nuclear power, it's kicked our asses every single time we went to war with it. It has, one of the most advanced, powerful countries in the world. Talk to Jews here, say, "Oh no, Israel is a tiny country, and this guy, all these Arab countries and 50 Muslim
That
countries."
needs protection from criticism.
Yeah, and it faces existential crisis on a daily basis. It can be wiped out any minute. Unrealistic. But that's the feeling. That's the sentiment. And when I talk about these powerful lobby groups, AIPAC and JDL and not JDL, the
ADL.
ADL, thank you. And here in state and Canada, we have the equivalent of these groups. They say, well, yeah, they behave badly, but they protect us.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to make sure to answer your question. Well, why do we do this in the diaspora? We don't have rockets. We don't have checkpoints. We have physical safety, but we don't think that we do, as Jews, because we're emotionally traumatized.
And here we have the conflict about the conflict,
Right.
And it's unfortunately it plays itself out in university campuses, schools, school boards, workplaces. Sometimes, in May 2 years ago, at the University of Toronto, at one of the most important schools in the university, professors and students were at each other's throats. And of course, there was shouting and yelling and swearing and claims of anti-Semitism, claim of Islamophobia, claims of this. It was a mess. It was horrible. Really, can't we do better?
Yeah, I think that's the key part is that we can and we have to do better. I think the other part I just want to be clear about is that we also talk quite a bit about why one story is known in the West and one isn't. And we try to deal honestly with this underlying fear, of brown Muslims, people that are stereotyped as brown Muslims. And it is an important part of why we know one story and we don't know another story. It's complicated. It's also because of guilt, because Canada and the US did very little to support Jews before, during, and after the Holocaust. And so there's a tremendous sense of sort of identifying with a group that they betrayed, that most Canadians and Americans feel are part of them. And this other group, they're not so sure are part of them. And I think that's a really important sort of nasty underbelly that we try to, to talk about in a straightforward way.
And that's why I brought up this question, because when we talk about the diaspora, in my opinion, the discrepancy and imbalance of power, I think, extends into here. When it comes to freedom of expression, Palestinian Americans think twice or three times before tweeting, or and there are examples of nasty websites like Canary Mission, for example, that has people's photos. I have a friend who they took a picture. They went to the Facebook profile of his younger sister, and they took a picture from there and posted it. So this is the kind of I think recognition of that in the diaspora groups aren't on an equal footing. But I'm mindful that people here have questions, and I would like to open the floor for questions from here. And in the meantime, I will also check for questions from our viewers online. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. My colleague Ruqayya here will give you the mic, if you don't mind introducing yourself. And then
I was very interested in hearing you both talking about the respective trauma and how it sort of locks people into just horrible places that you never resolve it. And I guess I also found it very interesting that you're both from in Canada,
Right.
and how that affects how you look at all this stuff. As an American,
He's American.
yeah, no, but
I live in
yeah, but it's living in Canada. And as an American, I always had this problem of why we have to look at everybody by the worst thing we can attach to them, rather than look at them as fellow human beings. And that in this small little planet that we're about to destroy, that we all have rights, we can all live together, we all have worth. And I've in the case of the United States, until I got involved in this whole issue about 15 years ago, everyone that I knew was Jewish were the most amazing people. And they were the civil rights activists. And I worked in the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. And I just kept thinking, how is this happening with people who can see the humanity of other people in all these different ways? You can't see it with your neighbor next door. And I remember when I first visited Israel and Palestine, walking down the street in Ramallah and looking at the sully 18-year-old leaning against the door. And then I'd smile, and here was this, old white American woman, and he'd smile back and wave. And I kept thinking, if the average Israeli meant the average Palestinian, and started the conversation that you have, they'd find out, what am I afraid of? And I don't know how do we change, and it's not just Israel and Palestine. You think of all over the world, all these conflicts we have. How do we start training people, raising our kids or whatever, to start looking at other human beings as human beings with rights? And in the United States, we have all kinds of problems in doing that. But we need to do that and not get stuck on what the traumas in the past are. And I was wondering how your dialogue leads you to getting to the next step, not just acknowledging what's happening now, but how do we get over it for both sides?
Sure.
No, thank you. So I'm sure you're aware that during your wonderful discussion tonight, you have left out certain elephants in the room. I kept waiting for it to come up.
Okay.
So I'm going to bring it up.
Of course, we don't know the elements in the room, so tell us, please.
Okay, so if you look at a map from 1948 to the present of Israeli areas versus Palestinian areas, you'll notice that the Palestinian areas have diminished to almost nothing, right? And why is that? Illegal settlements, right?
Of course.
Okay. Nobody's mentioned that. You talk about trauma from like the 1940s. Okay. I understand. But that is being used as an excuse to take over all of the land that supposedly was at one time Palestinian. And all you have to do is read the paper every day and you'll find out about how illegal settlements are cutting off water from Palestinian legal settlements. I'll tell you one story. This is the only one to mention because there are other areas that you simply have avoided tonight. And I understand why, because you want to have a kind of a high level dialogue. But I have a friend who was with Christian peacemakers, and she and the person she was working with had an assignment. Have you heard of them, by the way?
Christian peacemakers?
Christian peacemakers?
No.
Okay. They had an assignment of walking Palestinian kindergartners past a settlement area to get to their school.
To keep them safe, yeah.
We actually met someone last night who did that.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. This was Kim Lamberty. And they were attacked by settlers from the illegal settlement who were speaking with Brooklyn accents. She knew, okay? They broke her knees and damaged the lungs of the person she was walking with. The children ran away. This has not been discussed tonight, and I understand why, but I'm just bringing it up. Because when you talk about getting along together and everything, the land stealing is going on. The U.S. is giving as a gift over $3 billion a year for what? So that Israel can protect itself militarily from Palestinians. Okay,
Well,
thank you.
Well, I want to be really clear that two things. One is our work is primarily over here.
Right.
So where the important part that you've said is that very much we expect that a Jew would listen deeply to a Palestinian who says, my relatives lost their house. So Raja talked about Shesharak. The conflict over there lives over here as well.
Yeah.
And we, of course, we don't separate them. No, well, I don't think you found, if you read our book, that we separate them. So I think that's the, I think that's a really important part to get, is that, I mean, we said before, we are angry. I'm angry in a different way because it's, I have a detachment from it. I don't have to deal with it unless I choose to. Right. But yes. And how do I say this? We have chosen this path because this is the path that we think we can make the most difference. That doesn't mean that we don't daily sit across from each other and say, did you hear what happened yesterday in Israel, Palestine? Did you hear these houses that were destroyed? Did you hear that these soldiers came and arrested a 6-year-old Palestinian? We talk about it every single day.
Look, the Zionists who we deal with, the Zionists who we are reaching out to, condemn these events all the time.
That's what they're not doing anything about.
Well, some of them do. Some of them do what they can. I mean, but the events are over there are separate but related, right? And I mean, it's not really an elephant in the room. It's very well known what is happening over there, and I'm hoping that one day we will have an alliance of Palestinians and Jews who can work together to pressure the Canadian government, the American government, to do the right thing for both peoples. The direction of things has been getting worse and worse all the time. And now with the fascist government in Israel, God knows where things are going to go. And what do our governments do? Absolutely nothing. And there are many Zionists I know and I've worked with personally who are trying to pressure the Canadian government and the American government to stop Israel from the abuses that it's doing. They are not strong enough yet, but imagine a coalition of Palestinians and Jews one day working together, to that end.
The reality that we believe is that it is going to be largely Jewish people who change this dynamic, who come to a point, like I have and others have, that this is intolerable to our Judaism and to our humanity.
I'm just wondering,
Jay.
given the state of not only Palestinian-Israeli relations, but of world relations and what's going on in the US now, and looking at what's happening with social media and the challenge of kind of getting people to think about change. I mean, humans are resistant to change. It's unfortunate. And the dialogue that you've talked about is wonderful, but I'm wondering where you see hope in the change coming, given that so many sides want to protect what's going on now and don't want to do the change.
Exactly. Okay. Well, I mean, there are many things that we talk about, but I'll share 3. Our brain, sadly, is a fear-based organ. And its prime function is to protect us. The easiest way to protect us is to seek the simple story. The single story. The story that feels good, that we've heard before, that we trust. We have to break that. And the only way I know to break it is what we call from many to one. Is to stop thinking, for instance, of Jewish tragedy. Excuse me, the tragedy of the Holocaust is 6 million Jews, but one Jew killed 6 million times. Stop thinking of of the Palestinian Nakba as 750,000 displaced people, but one displaced person 750,000 times. And to see that person's deep shared humanity with yours. That's the first. The second is to draw a curtain between what did happen and what's happening. So these things that you talked about are happening every day, but a lot of their power is because they are actually an extension of something that's been happening for 75 years. And I think that's really important to understand. So if we deal with the new tragedy of every day for Palestinians singly and not lump them into all one tragedy, I think we have a possibility of doing something about it. And the third is with every corpuscle of our being, resist this thing we call groupthink. Separate our minds. We have, as Jews, in many ways, a single brain, and as Palestinians, a single brain. We will never find deep solutions as long as we function as a single brain. So those are the three hopes that I offer. And I'm hopeful because I'm not idealistic, but I believe in an idea.
Nothing feels worse than talking about trauma when you have, I have no idea, but in any case, fireworks.
Oh, fireworks. But they're celebrating our talk, I guess.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. And thank you for, hosting this space. I think the book, first of all, just its existence is very valuable and a really unique kind of experience for everyone here to be able to reflect on what can be done just through discussion. For me, I'm 25. I'm quite young.
I'm not.
We knew that.
Yeah. I think I'm at that point where I'm kind of getting, I'm getting towards 30. So I know that, right. Well,
It's almost over.
listen, sometimes it feels like it, but I know it's just starting. But I'm also, I've transitioned into adulthood and, well, all right, some might disagree, but that's all right. I think there's kind of been an understanding for me where I know that in the next few decades, the work you guys are doing now, my generation needs to be doing. And we need to, kind of grasp that this is something that's been going on way before I was born, way before a lot of people were born. And I'm wondering what it was when you guys were my age that kind of inspired you or put you on this certain trajectory of even just thinking about these issues from your perspective. I work at a nonprofit that deals with these issues, which you two know. And yeah, I just, I'm inspired tonight, and I would like to hear kind of what that might be from you guys.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I grew up in Lebanon when the 67 war happened. I was 8 years old, but I remember it very clearly. And more important than what happened then, I remember the face of my father when he sat down and just started not just crying, he was sobbing. He thought he is going to get to go back home. So you see these things, and they stay in you, and they continue to move you forever. So when I came to Canada and 35 years ago, it wasn't long before I started getting into activism and, joining organizations that through which I felt I could be doing something, and I think I mentioned earlier that, that struggle continued. I remember the 50th anniversary of the Nakba in 1998, and how, how we felt then about it and what we wanted to do as, younger people and all that kind of stuff. And then this year we mark the 75th year, from the Nakba, and nothing has changed. Things are getting worse. So, you have to care deeply about an issue before you get involved in it. And if if it's something you're going to do as a volunteer on a volunteer basis, then make sure you have a good source of income for yourself before you get into this other stuff, because it can suck you in. And it sucked me in. It sucked me in big time. I spent a lot of non-paid time work doing on activism and doing the things I cared for. But and when it comes to these kinds of issues, you need to really follow your heart and engage with people who you trust and will work well with you. One of the things I've experienced in working with Palestinians, Arabs, and so on in the last 25 years or so, is that especially among Palestinians, there are different levels of anger. All Palestinians are angry, and for good reason, but there are different levels of anger. And because of the frustration and the long-term, oppression and not being able to impact anything, or the anger keeps growing, and Palestinians find themselves in a situation where if you're not as angry as I am, I'm not going to be able to work with you, because it impacts how you work and the means that you follow. And that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate. And that's led to a factionalization of Palestinian work and Palestinian rights work, and the fact that we don't have the kinds of organizations that we need to advocate on behalf of Palestinian rights.
Right. And the way I'm going to answer it is very personally. Thank you for your answer. When I was about 12 and a half, 13, I discovered a letter on my parents' dining room table. And it was from an institution in Staten Island that was asking for money for their daughter, whose name is Stephanie. Well, that was my sister. I didn't know she existed. She was actually born with a very severe deficiency called microcephalia. And I knew nothing of her. And at 14 or so, I went to see her for the first time. She didn't recognize, she didn't know people, but she knew that there was something loving in her room. And she lived all the way till 47, which is very unusual for microcephs. So how come, am I sharing this in a Jewish-Palestinian conversation? Because I have been fortunate to frame my life with gifts and not loss. I didn't have a disabled sister. I had a sister I didn't know I had. So for most of my life, I've been able to view things, even hard things, through the lens that there's a gift on the other side of it. Even though we've talked a lot today about coming together and reconciliation, the reason I wrote this book is because of the grief I feel every day for what happens to Palestinians on the ground. And I chose that for me, this was the best way to counter it, to use my gifts, my expertise. That was the best way. It's not everybody's way. But because, I see life as a gift and not a loss, I'm able to be more, optimistic and hopeful. And I continue to do that. I mean, this book, Peter Barnard, was kind enough to say that this book is a miracle. you know, that a Jew and a Palestinian stuck together long enough to make this happen was something else. And I embrace and love that. I feel lucky about that every moment of every day.
We have got some bruises before, but they've healed.
We get along remarkably well. It's kind of, so we have
No casualties.
no casualties. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, by the way.
It's a lovely
Appreciate it.
question.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
In reading the internet during, I think it was the Gaza war of like 2012 or something, there was a dialogue between a man in Cedar Oak who had employed a man who was in Gaza. And one of them called themselves Peace Man and the other one was Hope Man. And I can't remember which was which. But what it said, which I think you guys represent, is when people get to know each other as human beings, you get a bond, and all these other traumas that we have kind of fall away because you see the person there. And somehow we have got to figure out how to get the people involved in this conflict, as well as others around the world, to start seeing the people that they're afraid of are oppressing, whichever it happens to be, as fellow human beings that have value and can be their friends. And if they get to know them, then they're both enriched, which I think is what your story with your sister.
Yeah.
Thank you. If we don't have any other questions, we can wrap it up.
Sure, we.
But
wrap
if you
up,
have
and
any,
you know, and please know that we'd love you to purchase a book.
Yeah.
They're $20, either cash credit or debit. Anyway, we have a little machine. And we'll, excuse me, we'd be more than happy to sign your book for you before you leave.
And keep in mind that the holiday season is coming up.
Yeah. Gifts. I mean,
This is a piece, you know, about peace, you know, it's a gift of peace.
well, I mean, we will.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, obviously my friend is being a little cheeky, but you know, in truth, we do offer this book as the beginning of a conversation. So if you know people that are
Yeah.
interested in the
I mean,
conversation.
to your
that's what
earlier
we're about.
point, Madam, is, you know, we have to start somewhere.
Right.
And right now, we are dealing with a situation where there's one narrative there and one narrative here, unknown to either side, each one's narrative, and they don't even want to know about the other side narrative. We're encouraging people to start to learn about each other's narrative, to understand why they think the way they do, why they behave the way they do. And it's not because they're evil. You know, it's not because, you know, they love.
Be a couple.
Yeah, there are a few. You know, you don't support Palestinians because you support terrorism, and you do not necessarily support Israel because you support apartheid. There are other reasons that people are, you know, emotionally attached to certain things. And we invite people to get to know about them.
And I know we're wrapping up. I just want to, you know, leave this in the space. There is always this connection to, you know, to groups who meet, you know, Palestinians and Jews meet. And as you mentioned before, then they go back, you know, and take advantage of all the privileges that they've always had. My message to my community is you can't go back. I can't go back. I can't go back to the way I used to think. I can't go back to just being comfortable that I have a space in Israel. I can't. So real change means you have to adjust. You have to live differently. You have to think differently. You have to take different actions. You can't just have a nice conversation and move back to your regular life.
You have to act.
You have to act differently. You have to act. Absolutely. You have to act differently.
And on that note, I mean, I think there is a responsibility that comes with knowledge, right? So
Absolutely.
knowledge entails responsibility, and unfortunately, as Palestinians, the burden is put on us to explain ourselves, to, you know, talk about our pain once and over again. And I think, you know, it becomes not. as a Palestinian who came to the US 10 years ago, I already have lived under occupation, and there have been a lot of conversations that have been part of, in which people ask about the experiences in ways that sometimes can make you relive your traumas, but then you don't get that empathy. And I think this is important. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I'm sure people may agree or disagree with your approach, but at the end of the day, it is an attempt, and life is full of attempts. And we're grateful for visiting us, crossing the border all the way here to DC. Thank you so much, and welcome again. And we look forward to hosting you in the future. Two things: if you'd like to purchase the book, Raja and Jeff here will take care of that, and you can also use modern technology beyond cash to purchase the book. I think Jeff has a little device that magically does that. And I would like to remind you all that on this month we have a number of events that we would love to have you join us for them. On October 17th, we're hosting the Edward Said Memorial Lecture with Professor Wadia Said, who will talk about his father's legacy. On October 19th, we are doing another book talk with Reverend Don Wagner, who is going to talk about his journey with Palestinian rights. And of course, on November 10th, we're hosting our annual conference, which this year will be titled One Palestine, the Struggle Against Apartheid. It's going to be a one-day conference, and we invite you all to join us. The link is on our website, thejerusalemfund.org. Make sure to RSVP. And again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. The website for the book is thewallbetween.org. If you want to read more about it or talk to people more about it.
Can I give it to you? Or
Of course.
You're